just a few words about Poe. I'm not going to go deep into his biography because um, you guys can get that on your own time if you're curious, or if it's relevant to things that you're seeking in your research. Yeah, just a few words. So he's born in 1809 in Boston and died in 1849 in Baltimore. So 40 years, not a long life, unfortunately, but he was quite productive and prolific in his short life, despite problems with drugs and alcohol and a lot of personal upheavals and traumas in his life. Son of two actors, which is really uncommon and rather interesting. And he ends up putting a lot of stage metaphors in his work, which you'll see. And the fact that he was orphaned is also relevant to his work and his biography and just his life trajectory in general. Um, these transcendentalists that you see here, and you probably know already because they're famous, they were the kind of the big names of the literary scene in Massachusetts as Poe was kind of coming into his adulthood, and transcendentalism was um, a big deal. And as these things go, usually a new literary trend will replace or respond to or answer the last one. So there were elements that were being responded to by the transcendentalists, and they were on the cusp of romanticism, but they had some tendencies that later the younger generation, including Poe, felt like they needed to respond to or critique. And so you had what were called the anti transcendentalists or anti transcendentalism. And of course, as most things go, that would be a bit of an overgeneralization. Poe was sometimes quoted as saying, like, he's not necessarily against the transcendentalists per se, although he also did criticize them. He wasn't like an enemy, um, but he had some criticisms for the transcendentalists. And on the left here, you see Hawthorne, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and on the right is Herman Melville. Hawthorne was born a little bit before Poe, and then came Melville. These anti-transcendentalists had a few things in common. They are also called dark romanticists. One thing that differentiated the dark romantics or the anti-transcendentalists from the transcendentalists or the strictly speaking romantics, where they had a more pessimistic attitude or a darker attitude. Thoreau or Emerson would tend to think that all we had to do is get past kind of conventions and society and certain religious institutions or institutions, cultural or governmental institutions, as an individual in nature, we could transcend and reach our potential. um, the anti-transcendentalists took on a more pessimistic attitude about that, and that it wasn't such an easy thing in the world, or it didn't guarantee a life of ease or even a life of fulfillment. That mankind and humanity and life itself were somehow destined or doomed to death and decay. For Poe, that may have been formed in his upbringing or some of the traumatic events of his early life and the death of other people in his life. Um, so his pessimism was probably somewhat a result of experience. Anti-transcendentalists, they focused on man's uncertainty and limited potential in the universe, that man was at the whims of nature. You see that in the sublime aspects of Poe's writing, like Descent in the Maelstrom and Manuscript Found in a Bottle, or Nature as Vast and Incomprehensible, also a kind of a nod to the sublime. Whereas nature in for the transcendentalists was kind of wholesome and your friend, and you can kind of walk among the flowers and be happy, which is a nice sentiment, to be honest. But for the anti-transcendentalists, um, nature was something to fear. Like, for instance, young Goodman Brown for Hawthorne, in the forest is where the devil dances and the debaucheries occur. And nature for Melville, for instance, was the pursuit of the whale, or that human existence was somehow fraught or doomed. You get in a book like in a short story by Melville called Bartleby the Scrivener. No relation. Uh, yeah, Bartleby the Scrivener. That's his occupational title. Anyway, so yeah, you just a little bit more doom and gloom among these anti-transcendentalists. Malevolent forces exist, evil exists. I think the transcendentalists like to think that we can just transcend into a better world of goodness, whereas the anti-transcendentalists are like, no, evil exists. It's a malevolent force. It's in a lot of ways inescapable, and human beings aren't necessarily innately good. They can be a corrupting influence, a malevolent influence. And they also, interestingly, especially for Poe, we'll get into this in his essay, The Philosophy of Composition, where he valorized the faculty of will over inspiration or divine inspiration, where the act of writing is an act of will, almost like a mathematical formula, he calls it, rather than for a lot of those early romantics over on the other side of the pond, and for someone like Emerson, it was like this mystical experience where suddenly you'd be enraptured by some power that takes over you, and you can't explain it. It's ineffable, inexplicable. But for Poe, you see in his essay that it's just this kind of almost just this rote, mundane routine of like, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean it's like he has the will to create a great poem like The Raven, and he's like, well, I want to make a great poem, and I can just do it through this and that act of will, and I can just tick off of the boxes of all the things you need for a great poem, and at the end of the day it'll satisfy the requirements of a great poem, and it'll be great. At least that's the sense you get in Poe's essay. So The Philosophy of Composition, written towards the end of his life. We'll just go into it just a little bit. Most writers, poets in especial, prefer having it understood that they compose by a species of fine frenzy, an ecstatic intuition, and would positively shudder at letting the public take a peep behind the scenes, at the elaborate and vacillating crudities of thought, at the true purposes seized only at the last moment, at the innumerable glimpses of an idea that arrive not at the maturity of full view, and the fully matured fancies discarded in despair as unmanageable, at the cautious selections and rejections. So, real quick, so you see what's going on here. He's describing the act of writing as like this torturous process where you're not being divinely inspired to write perfection. But the act of writing is actually like, well, you start, it's no good, you throw it away, you start again. It's like a mundane process. It's unglamorized, it's unromanticized. And I think he's being quite honest. And I think a lot of writers would recognize that, yes, indeed, this is actually how writing is. You do these things, you have to cross things out and start over. A side note, I have another video series where I talk about Tolkien's writing a lot. Sometimes we discuss some of his, when we think about like Lord of the Rings or Tolkien or any great work of literature, we think of the end product. We don't usually look at what it took to get there. We don't look at the roads not taken, or the roads taken briefly for a few months, and then when you realize, to finish my novel, I can't actually do this. I have to erase that chapter and go back and change this character, and so there's a lot of false starts. There's a lot of rejections when you're writing. So again, this is Poe kind of, as in the Wizard of Oz, he's kind of pulling back the curtain and showing all the the mechanisms that are behind the scenes in order to convey the final product of a work of art. So, sorry, that was a little bit of a digression. Let me continue since I stopped at mid sentence. Rejections at the painful erasures and interpolations. In a word, at the wheels and pinions, the tackle for scene shifting, the step ladders and demon traps, the cock's feathers, the red paint and the black patches, which, in 99 cases out of 100, constitute the properties of the literary histrio. And that word histrio is what? It's an actor. So, as is normally the case with Poe, or is often the case with Poe, he deploys a metaphor from the theater. If you recall, his mother and his father were historios. They were actors on stage. Okay, and his mother, who died tragically when Poe was just a few years old. And I'm sure that was obviously a traumatic moment, but certainly a life-changing moment for Poe. And the fact that he had this mother who was an actress who died put in Poe's mind this idea that that we are all actors. You know, Shakespeare was right. All the world's a stage, and the men and women are mere actors. And there's something really sad about that realization. And the fact is that it's also a temporary arrangement. At some point, the play ends and the actors leave the stage, as was the case with his mother, Eliza Poe, who left the stage too soon. And of course, you get superimpositions of this same motif in Poe, like, for instance, in Ligeia, when Ligeia dies, too young and too beautiful. So maybe an echo of his mother. But it's quite fascinating that, or she puts forth this poem before she dies, and it's all about stage scenery, and it's all about this extended conceit of the stage being the theater of the absurd of life, which will never amount to much and which will always end in decay when the worm or death has the last say. So, just a quick glance, and we'll go back to the philosophy of composition, but a quick glance at this poem from Ligeia, The Conqueror Worm. Lo, 'tis a gala night. Within the lonesome latter years, an angel throng, bewinged, bedight, in veils and drowned in tears, sit in a theatre to see a play of hopes and fears, while the orchestra breathes fitfully the music of the spheres. Mimes in the form of God on high mutter and mumble low, as hither and thither fly mere puppets as they who come and go at bidding of vast formless things that shift the scenery to and fro, flapping from out their condor wings invisible woe. Out, out are the lights, it out all, and over each quivering form the curtain, a funeral pall, comes down with the rush of a storm. And the angels, all pallid and wan, uprising, unveiling, affirm that the play is the tragedy man, and its hero, the conqueror worm. So, a little depressing, but beautiful in its melancholy. Okay, back to the philosophy of composition. It will not be regarded as a breach of decorum on my part to show the modus operandi by which some one of my own works was put together. I select The Raven as the most generally known. It is my design to render it manifest that no one point in its composition is referable either to accident or intuition, that the work proceeded step by step to its completion, with the precision and rigid consequence of a mathematical problem. Just like in The Conqueror Worm, where you kind of look behind the scenes and see the mechanisms of artifice, here he's kind of revealing to you the designs that normally most poets would hesitate or shy away from revealing. You know, it's like the magician giving away the trick that sets up the illusion. unromantic about the process. And again, we almost don't know whether how much we can believe him. I mean, maybe he's lying to us. Maybe he's telling you what his secret formula is, but he's pretending to tell it to you, but he actually has a secret formula still cleverly concealed in his back pocket. When indeed men speak of beauty, they mean precisely not a quality as it is supposed, but an effect. They refer, in short, to that intense and pure elevation of the soul, not of intellect or of heart, upon which I have commented, and which is experienced in consequence of contemplating the beautiful. So, to a certain extent, we can see a little bit of what T.S. Eliot would later call the objective correlative in this analysis, which means a situation or a set of events which act as the formula for evoking a particular emotion. As if, again, if you set up the scene just right, as it were on a stage, that you can extract emotions, intense emotions from your audience. Just like in a story or a poem, if you set it up just right, you can extract or provoke just the right emotional response from your reader. You can also connect it to Longinus's idea of the sublime, an idea that beauty isn't, that there's something beautiful in something that you can't entirely comprehend. So I think this is why Poe is so interested in maelstroms, some overwhelming force of nature that's mysterious and is all kind of devouring. So, Message in a Bottle, let's look at it for a few minutes. Message in a Bottle evokes a sense in which you're kind of questioning the author's credibility. And I would ask, what in the story makes you wonder if this author is credible? And clearly, it's the fact that he purports to put this message in a bottle. And he tells this story of being basically going into a series of shipwrecks and catastrophes, but somehow he manages to still be writing. You know, how can he, basically fall down into the depths of the sea? Some scholars say that he was going into a hole in Antarctica that brought him to the hollow center of the world, or possibly just another maelstrom that he dips into in the sea, in a churning sea. But regardless, some kind of physical or environmental catastrophe is befalling him. But he seems to be still able to write about it. Usually when you're falling into a giant hole, you're not going to have the presence of mind to be writing about this. So that in itself makes us think maybe this author's not credible. But it's still an enjoyable ride, and the idea of a non-credible narrator is a common theme in Poe. Whether the narrator calls himself insane, as in The Telltale Heart, or has some other deficiency, or is a drug addict, or is insane, or the author or the narrator in Poe's stories is usually somewhat of a suspect credibility, or maybe the questionable accuracy of the narration is part of the charm or part of the effect. For instance, in A Telltale Heart, it's the insanity, the insane oration that the narrator provides that kind of convinces us that this guy is insane, which makes it the logical which the logical consequence is he kind of outs himself as the murderer because he loses his sanity and he thinks he's hearing the heart under the floorboards. So if that narrative voice wasn't as crazy as it ends up being in the story, we wouldn't be along for that emotional ride, and the the payoff would not be it wouldn't make sense actually. So Poe often uses the non-credible narrator to interesting effects. The vastness and sublimity of nature, interest in exploration, which is evident in several of his works, especially interest in Antarctica. And some critics have argued that manuscript found in a bottle hints at the hollow earth theories of John Cleese Sims and Jeremiah Reynolds. The narrator finds a ghost ship in the sea, and there's a lot of ghost ships in literature, but the Flying Dutchman is the most commonly referenced, and this is probably a reference to the Flying Dutchman, a ghost ship that kind of skulks around in the waters. But when Poe was describing this ghost ship, I couldn't help but think or call to mind the Vasa. And the Vasa was a famous shipwreck in Sweden, and it was like the biggest ship of its time. I don't know if you could kind of get the sense for how gigantic this ship is, but you on the very lower right hand, you can see people walking on the floor under this ship. So this ship was dredged up in the 1950s because it sunk just a mile off the coast of Stockholm. But it was the biggest ship of its kind of its time, but it only made it like a mile out to sea or less before it sunk. And you can see along the side all these gun portals or windows for cannons to defend the ship. Poe could have been referencing the Vasa because it was quite a famous shipwreck. And also it kind of is reminiscent of the idea that, again, this anti-transcendentalist idea that man is but a leaf at the mercy of the forces of nature, the gales and maelstroms beyond man's control. And here's the Vasa, which was supposed to be like this testament to human achievement and technology and science, and even it, for whatever reason, kind of fell under the weight of its own grandeur and ended up being this useless hulk at the bottom of the sea. Just to give you a sense of how enormous this was, this is a model of its like kind of a cross section of the ship, and you could see all these little worker bees at the various levels below decks. There's 4 below decks levels, and then a storage level under that. There's barrels and people, workers. There's crew. It's just an enormous ship, and this is kind of the ship that I envisioned the narrator finding in the middle of the sea, this ghost ship. Interestingly enough, Gustavus Vasa, this ship, the Vasa, was named after Gustavus Vasa, which was like a Swedish king. And just by a strange coincidence, or maybe this is just something that I'm just kind of forcing together that don't go together. But so it's possible that Poe had heard of the Vasa because it's a famous shipwreck. But interestingly, his Histrio actress mother, the last play that she performed before she died was a play called Gustavus Vasa, about the king that the Vasa was named for. So maybe Poe had in the back of his mind this idea of the Vasa as being, again, this kind of this notion of the inevitable failure of life, or the pessimism of human achievement, that just like his mother died so young, so tragically, the Vasa went down tragically. And I don't know, maybe Poe is using this as a reference to the Vasa going down under the sea, this giant, immense ship. And the narrator also has a Swedish companion, and the Vasa was a Swedish ship. So again, I don't know if there's anything here, but it's just something that I thought I'd throw out as an idea. Maybe scholars in the future can prove me wrong or prove me right. Okay, one or two more things about the anti-transcendentalists. They were interested in new science and electricity and this thing called galvanism, which is Luigi Galvani famously electrified frog legs and made them twitch. So the whole bunch of scientists looking into the animating principle and how electricity can animate life, how a human organism or an organism uses electric impulses on the motor nerves. All kinds of research that really had never been done were being done around this time. And famously, Mary Shelley used the interest in this research during this time to make Frankenstein, to write Frankenstein, which is a corpse that has been animated, jump starting the corpse into a sentient being. It kind of brought up a bunch of questions of like, what is life? Is life just material science? A whole literature came out at the time, and a whole interest in galvanizing corpses. The influential research of Luigi Galvani. Uh, Also, at this period, there was a series of cholera epidemics and epidemics in general, typhus and catalepsy, which caused um, their victims to fall into catalepsy. And in the 19th century, the graveyard was a place of both danger and comfort. Loved ones lost too soon were visited regularly, and yet grave robbers sought out fresh corpses to sell to medical schools. Wrapped up in all these mixed emotions was the specter of accidentally being buried. The specter of accidentally being buried alive. A shocking number of people supposedly underwent this horrific fate in the 1800s. But without modern medical devices and heart monitors, how could anyone really tell when a loved one had passed on? In Poe's story, Premature Burial, he talks about all these devices used to prevent himself from being buried prematurely. And these were actually built in this time. Like, oh, if you're still alive, you could press a button inside your coffin and a little flag will come up and tell everyone you're still alive. So, post premature burial, it purports to discuss actual instances of premature burial. But then the narrator, when you think that he's being buried prematurely, it ends up being it's a bad dream. He's actually like on a cramped he's like in a cramped quarters. He's not actually in a casket. Again, the idea of the narrator's non credibility, like the narrator can be fooled about about what is actually happening. Okay, that was just a few brief themes running through some of Poe's work, and so stay tuned next week, and we'll eventually get to the Raven and some of his later work. Um, Thank you for joining us, and take care. I'll see you next week.